there were killings both of citizens as well as of army and paramilitary personnel, because they were physically stopping them, manhandling them, throwing Molotov cocktails at them, and trying to stop the army from entering Tiananmen. Our flat was on top of the main avenue of Eternal Peace, and we have seen an incident where an armored personal carrier was surrounded by the public. The hatch was open,
Right.
and the soldiers were taken out and beaten. Now, no army in the world, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship, would tolerate this situation. And this was repeated in multiple places around the city.
Hello and welcome to Strat News Global. I am Nitin Gokhale, and with me is a special guest today, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who was India's Foreign Secretary till January 2020. But he's here not to speak about his tenure as Foreign Secretary, but something more distant, and that is exactly 31 years ago. On 4th of June, as we all are aware, there was a Tiananmen Square episode or incident, a massacre if you want to call it, in Beijing in 1989. And Vijay Gokhale was in Beijing, posted to the Indian embassy at that point in time. And today, we are going to recall that incident, the build-up to that incident, and what he experienced as a young diplomat posted in Beijing at that point in time. Welcome, Vijay, to this program, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nitin. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Thank you. So let's go back to 1989. Tell us, was that your first posting to Beijing? Who else was there with you? And what was the atmosphere like in Beijing in those years, really?
Well, it was my first posting to China, because at that time Hong Kong was still under British rule. And although I had studied the Chinese language in Hong Kong, I had no occasion to visit mainland China, as we used to call it, until March of 1988, when I was posted there. For us, of course, as young diplomats, it was a very exciting time because China was going through a period of modernization and opening up, and we had heard a lot of stories about China when we were in university. And so it was a very nice experience to be there. We were very fortunate in having a remarkable collection of people in the embassy. Of course, our ambassador was C.V. Ranganathan. And our joint secretary in Delhi looking after East Asia was Vijay Nambiar. And both of them had served in China during the Cultural Revolution. So they understood the mass campaigns and movements that had taken place. And then, of course, at the deputy ambassador level, you had Shiv Shankar Menon, who had also been very often in the square. Our sources, at least those that all of us in the Indian embassy were talking to, were more often the Chinese media than the students or the Western media.
Right.
The Western media, on the other hand, tended to rely on the students.
Yeah, you got the correct picture. Even Jaydev mentioned that they used to go to the barricades, you were there at night, you all were there till late night, get the correct picture from there. But then, how did the attitude of the state harden gradually? And then what is the final sort of conclusion on the 4th of June when the massacre happened? Do you have a recollection of that? What happened between May to 4th June?
So essentially, on the 20th of May, once martial law was declared, there was a sort of interregnum for 2 weeks until the 3rd of June, when very little action actually took place on the ground. Many of the army units had moved in, but were essentially stationary and had been surrounded by groups of citizens who were trying to explain to them that the students' grievances and the movement was legitimate and no hard action, no military action should be taken against them. Now, given this interregnum, the Western media put forward all kinds of theories, including the fact that the General Secretary Chao Ziyang had returned after being deposed. There were theories about Deng being ill and in hospital. There was another theory about army units of the PLA refusing to act, and in fact, some possibility of clashes between PLA units. But as we, of course, now know, none of this was true. Essentially, what Deng Xiaoping was doing was tying up all the loose ends before he actually took action. So effectively, what he did was he brought the Chinese media under control by stationing PLA units inside the media organizations and ensuring that they adhered to the party line. He stopped movement within China between the provinces and the capital so that the trains and the buses were brought under control so no students could move to and fro, and therefore he cut links between the student movement in Beijing and students elsewhere. He brought the army under control by telling them that they were the army of the Communist Party. They were not the army of the nation, he said. They were loyal to the party, and therefore they need to be loyal to them. And lastly, he then got the consent of the senior veterans of the party, leaders who had led the struggle in the 1940s and 50s. Only when he had tied up all these loose ends did Deng Xiaoping take military action on the 3rd of June. Night of the 3rd and the forenoon of the 4th. In a sense, this is an object lesson also for us, the manner in which the Chinese leadership acts, preparing themselves before doing it, which sometimes is mistaken outside China as dithering, is in fact deliberation. They were deliberating, they were not dithering. But on the 4th of June, as I said, now it is evident even from the testimonies given by many of the student leaders who now are living in the United States that there were very, very few students who died inside the square. The square had largely been vacated by the midnight of the 3rd of June, and the few that were left were persuaded to move out by the army when they came. And what the tanks which rolled into the square essentially rolled over empty tents. There was a lot of shooting outside the square in the approaches leading to it. But there, to be fair to the Chinese side, and I don't hold any brief for them, there were killings both of citizens as well as of army and paramilitary personnel, because they were physically stopping them, manhandling them, throwing Molotov cocktails at them, and trying to stop the army from entering Tiananmen. Our flat was on top of the main avenue of Eternal Peace, and we have seen an incident where an armored personal carrier was surrounded by the public. The hatch was open, and the soldiers were taken out and beaten. Now, no army in the world, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship, would tolerate this situation. And this was repeated in multiple places around the city. So, in that sense, there were a number of civilian deaths because the army fired at them whenever they tried to block the roads. But some of these were under provocation as well. Of course, the international damage, the damage to the reputation of China was very great as a result of this, because Western media was the dominant media then. It still is now, but it was much more dominant then. And they entirely spread the narrative across the world of the so-called Tiananmen massacre. Now, I think there is a much more realistic estimate. But it is regrettable that at that time, both foreign media and Western embassies spread the word of thousands dead, thousands dying, and many more injured, and so on. And that impression persists till today.
Correct. So, what is the final question to you? What is the lesson that the Chinese learned from that incident? Because since then, their grip has only tightened over the citizens and the entire administration, as well as the PLA. I mean, the whole notion of PLA serving the party is now, I think, well embedded in their mindset, isn't it?
Yes, I think they took two lessons of it. The first lesson was that they needed to ensure that there was no openness in the political system, even while they were determined that they would pursue economic openings. And Deng Xiaoping ensured that economic openings were not affected in any way. In fact, that is the time it took off, and it has resulted in China today being the second largest economy in the world. So they never changed their view on opening up and reform, but they were more realistic in realizing that when they opened up economically, certain influences would come in, certain undesirable political influences like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, democracy, and so on. And they were guarding themselves against that, and they strengthened their ideology. The second lesson that they drew, and it persists till today, is that the West, and in particular the United States, was determined to effect a regime change by some means or the other. That impression persists till today. A belief that they would use any means possible, including through inducement of westernization and Western thought, to bring down the communist regime. So that is another, and that view was strengthened because within 6 months of Tiananmen, the Soviet Union collapsed. Berlin Wall came down. So they have studied that subject to the death, and they have drawn the very firm conclusion that the West is determined to stop the Communist Party's further march to power, and they are determined to preserve the communist supremacy in China at all costs. These were the two big lessons they took away from Tiananmen.
Yes, indeed, and it persists even today, and we know the kind of powerful country that it has become, both militarily and economically. But thank you very much for these recollections and these memories that you've carried from there, and very many lessons about people studying China. That a lot of people tend to misread China, but you have given us a kind of a insight into how not to mislead China, and for that, I think our viewers will be very grateful. But thanks for your time, and it was lovely chatting with you. Viewers, don't forget to like us on our social media platforms, and of course, keep sending feedback. But until the next time, it's goodbye and good luck.
Thank you. The international damage, the damage to the reputation of China was very great as a result of this, because Western media was the dominant media then. It still is now, but it was much more dominant then. And they entirely spread the narrative across the world of the so-called Tiananmen massacre. Now, I think there is a much more realistic estimate. But it is regrettable that at that time, both foreign media and Western embassies spread the word of thousands dead, thousands dying, and many more injured, and so on. And that impression persists till today.